You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast. Hello, Will.
Hello, David.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 54 of the Common Descent Podcast, and happy Darwin Day.
Happy Darwin Day.
Darwin Day is, of course, a celebration of science, specifically the life and successes and scientific contributions of one Charles Darwin. You may recall that back on episode 28 last year around Darwin Day, we did a special episode about Charles Darwin.
Made sense.
With special guest Dr. Sarah Bray. This time, today's episode is about a lesser-known man named Alfred Russell Wallace.
Second verse slightly different than the first.
Yes. Wallace is the other guy, right? Famously, the story goes, Darwin spent like 30 years slowly and meticulously putting together this wacky idea of descent with modification by means of natural selection as the mechanism for evolutionary processes. And then he got a letter one day
From a young upstart.
from an upstart young man in Southeast Asia somewhere that said, well, hey, Mr. Darwin. Gee willikers, Mr. Darwin. I had this crazy idea that I came up with all by
This
myself.
wacky idea.
And Darwin went, So that's who we're talking about today. Wallace is a fascinating figure, legitimately also arrived at the same broad evolutionary hypothesis.
Yeah.
Really interesting guy, lot of really excellent scientific work, and we are thrilled to announce that we will, once again, after the news break, be joined by Dr. Sarah Bray, who is a biologist and Darwin etc. enthusiast and one of the hosts of a podcast called Discovering Darwin, which is one of my favorite podcasts. I love Discovery. They do such a good job.
It's a lot of fun.
This topic was also suggested, this overshadowed man, by Greta on Facebook and by one of our patrons, Sean. So thank you to Greta and Sean.
Yeah, thanks for giving Wallace some of the limelight, guys.
Yeah, we'll do a whole episode about him now, just for you. In case you don't know, by the way, listeners, Darwin Day is on February 12th, a celebration of the birthday of Darwin. This year is the 210th birthday, I believe,
He's getting up
of
there.
Darwin. So check your local museums and universities and such, because I bet those nerds are doing something fun.
They usually have something cool going on.
We're doing something fun at the museum. We have so many people coming to the museum. It's going to be awesome.
That's
I
fantastic.
can't wait. If any of you are listening, by the way, are in the East Tennessee area, come to the Gray Fossil Site on February 9th, which is actually going to be the day that this releases. So you know what? Never mind. Moving
Listen
on.
to this on the way there.
Yeah, if you caught this the
If you're listening to this now, turn around.
Quick, go over
Wherever
there.
you're going, quickly. To Gray you must go.
The switch on the wall behind you. Now, some announcements before we get started. We always have at least a couple of announcements. As always, this podcast, the support that allows us to pay to host the podcast, to pay for this wonderful equipment we're using, to pay for some exciting things that are coming up soon that will be discussed in future episodes, comes from our patrons on
Yes, it does.
Patreon. Huge thanks to our patrons, as always. This is the first episode in a very long time where we actually don't have any new shout-outs to
No.
say this episode. That's not to say we haven't had new patrons. We have. They just haven't been at the level that you get shout-outs. But you silent benefactors,
Thank you. We thank you greatly.
behind the scenes, the people behind the people. If you are not a patron, think about it, because there's a lot of cool behind-the-scenes extra stuff you get. And indeed, patrons, within the next several weeks, we're going to be making some changes to the goodies offered on Patreon. We're not taking anything away. We will be adding stuff, changing things.
The 2019 update.
The 2019 patch, the Patreon patch. It's going to be better than ever, so keep your eyes out for that. I think that's all the announcements. We should mention,
Yeah.
by the way, that as we are recording this news section, right at this very moment, somewhere on this very planet, the Super Bowl is happening.
Yeah, people are throwing a weird-shaped ball
It's
around.
covered in pig or something.
Mm.
It's got laces out.
Laces out.
Out. That's 2 Ace Ventura references in like a minute. This is what we're doing on Super Bowl Sunday. Thanks for joining us, nerds. All right, that's enough introduction. Let's get on to the news every episode. We choose a couple of news articles from recent paleontology, evolutionary science, life history study, and bring them to you because that's fun. And now I'd like to turn it over to Will at the news desk. Will?
Hi, everybody. I have some news about Mises. There has been a recent published paper about an extensive experiment with field mice, deer mice, to be precise, that has been able to observe the effects of natural selection in multiple populations, as well as isolate the gene apparently responsible.
That is a very fitting news bit for this episode's topic.
It's awesome. So, the research we're looking at is by Barrett et al. And published in Science, and the article we'll be linking to is by Ed Young in The Atlantic. So, the natural selection concept they're looking at is not an easy thing to get as a big picture. Typically, most natural selection experiments and research studies can only focus on one part, isolate the gene that relates to a feature, but not actually observe that gene affected by natural selection.
Right.
The other thing that typically happens is you usually can see side effects, but you're not usually able to get down to the nitty-gritty causes because you weren't there while it was happening. The common and popular version of this is the light and dark moths.
Yeah, the peppered moths.
Mm-hmm. In the Industrial Evolution, that as soot covered the bark of the trees, the light moths who used to survive on the light bark were now picked off by predators as the rarer dark moths became more successful.
Right.
And so that's watching the process of selection happen, but you're not seeing what's being you're not finding the actual genetic causes. You're not finding what in the genome is changing because we didn't do genetic studies on that back then. This aims to do both of that and more. So the animals they looked at are deer mice. These are small rodents that have naturally a variety of coat colors, lighter and darker, browner and blonder, so on and so forth. The mice also live on slightly different ecosystems. They live on, grassy hills, but also sandier hills. And the sandier hills are typically lighter colored sand, and the grassy hills typically have darker dirt, darker earth. So they have different environments that they naturally live on. So the idea, much like the pepper moths, that lighter coated mice would survive better on the sand and the darker coated mice would survive better on the dirt is obvious.
Yeah, makes sense.
But just because it makes sense doesn't mean that's good enough answer.
Right.
And that's kind of the point they tried to make with this is that's been something we've always talked about being a thing that happens to animals, but it's been very few times that people have actually observed it happen, observed a population split because of how they match their habitat. And that's something that they aim to do. So they began the long process in 2010 in Nebraska of setting up 6 164 square foot enclosures.
Wow.
3 on the dark soil and 3 on the sandy soil. Went into the enclosures and removed all the mice that weren't deer mice and all the rattlesnakes, and then caught 500 extra deer mice from the surrounding area and distributed them among each habitat, each of the enclosures, so that now they had 6 relatively equal, split between light and dark habitats, equal variation in the coat color, and equal sizes, roughly.
This is the kind of thing that most scientists these days do on the computer.
Exactly. This is a huge undertaking. They not only collected all these mice, they took DNA samples, photographed, and radio chipped each mouse.
Wow.
So this was thorough.
Yeah.
And then for the next few years, they monitored the population to observe any changes that happened. Within the first few months, expectedly, a lot of the mice died. Hunted by owls and other predators mostly. Not one, they removed the snakes because they didn't want to to enclose them with the predators, but aerial predators, you can't do that, and they still wanted there to be predation.
Right.
So
also, I assume snakes are going to be less fooled by the visual camouflage.
Yeah.
As they are less visual hunters than your birds of prey.
Yeah, especially those rascally pit vipers.
With their infrared vision.
With their predator vision. Now, after the few months, they collected and surveyed the survivors, or went through and collected in each habitat, and immediately noticed that the average coloration of coats of the survivors had leaned toward lighter coats in the sandy environments and darker coats in the dark soil environments.
Right. As predicted.
As predicted. And then they took it the next step. And this is where this study goes from really impressive to really awesome. Other people have quoted that most studies would stop there, and that would be good enough to actually show that was a successful and pertinent selection pressure. But then they sequenced a specific gene, the agouti gene, which was already known to be connected to fur color. So this was a previously identified gene. So they took it from all 481 remaining mice and sequenced this gene.
Wow.
And they found 7 mutations that had become more common in the lighter populations than in the darker, where they had become less common. Before the experiment, these mutations were equally dispersed among all the populations.
How cool to watch both the phenotypic and genotypic changes in the same experiment.
And it gets better.
What? Go on.
They identified one specific mutation that seemed to be the main culprit, the delta SIR, S-E-R. Delta SIR was the mutation that seemed to have the largest effect. So they took that, engineered it into normal lab mice, and they grew with lighter coats. So they didn't just find it, but they confirmed that that was the effect.
And that's how you do that.
Yes.
And I think that this might not be common knowledge, that we can't look at a gene and know what it does. We have to take it and put it in an animal and see what happens.
They don't have little descriptors next to them.
So that, I guess, was them confirming that it wasn't just... Because it's safe to infer that change tracked the coat color, but now you absolutely know that is what that gene was doing.
There is zero doubt. And this also completely confirms that these mutations were the ones being selected for and against by natural selection in this scenario.
What a cool experiment.
It's so thorough. And they have a huge description on the nightmare of setting up the enclosure. So,
I'm sure.
So many things of the mice fitting through the cracks, so they had to pour concrete into the gaps of the joints, and then snow drifts pushing up against the wall. It's an amazing study.
Item number 151 on today's glitch list.
It was one of my favorite moments. Was a quote by Barrett, who said, "Utter ignorance was a good thing in this study," he's saying. Because until this point, he had only worked with small fish. And as he puts it, anyone who had worked with mice would have never attempted this.
That's like if you had gone to mice people, they'd have just been like, no. Do it on the computer.
Yeah. What are you, crazy?
I would love to see this team of people. I really hope that they finished this publication and went, so what other animals have we never worked with?
Yeah. I get it. I picture them when they were back in 2010 starting it and going up to like some lab mice people and asking them questions. They go, "You sort of seem to have a lot of questions. What are you trying to do?" "Oh, well," explains experiment. "All right, goodbye now." And walks off all happy. And they're just like, poor soul.
Those poor souls. Do you think it'll work? It'll take a miracle.
So
that's so cool.
It was just
that's great.
And it's one of those where I didn't make this paradigm shifting discovery, but this is one of the first times where they've been able to, on a large scale, observe natural selection and confirm its effect, which is important.
And this is also like classic experimental setup.
Yes.
Made a prediction, tested that prediction, confirmed it with went multiple stages in, like that. Folks, that's science.
This is the golden And it really is a golden example of science, because not only was it done very well, but they also included all the hiccups and nightmares of trying to run a yet undone experiment.
I am going to read this paper.
It was so much fun.
I really want to read it. That's super cool.
There's multiple sources, and they both start out slightly different, and I couldn't decide which one was the better version of the story. So feel free to look this up and read it on different places, because it's great. This one starts with him in a bar.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, my first news piece is not an experiment at all, but a description of a new, very, very strange creature. Since we're talking about natural selection and the weird things it does, this is a report of a Triassic reptile, so you already know that it's going to be weird, that has an unusual body shape that is strikingly similar in some ways to a platypus.
Huh.
Get ready. This is research by Long Chung et al. In Scientific Reports, which is open access, so you can read it. And the article we are going to be linking to is from our commonly cited journalist Laura Gegel on Live Science. Researchers have described 2 new specimens of a reptile named Eretmorhipus caraldongi.
Bless you.
From the lower Triassic, the early Triassic that is, of China. This is a species of reptile that has been known before, but only from partial skeletons that were headless. We had never seen the skull of this animal before, so what we knew about it was that it was about 70 centimeters long, or, not quite 2.5 feet. So that's a pretty small animal, with a rigid body and tail and 4 large flippers. So this was a swimming animal, an aquatic reptile. It also has these triangular bony plates along its back, kind of like Stegosaurus.
Cool.
Very strange. It is not one of the big groups of marine reptiles of the Mesozoic. It belongs to a group called the Hupasuchians, which are the sister group, the close relatives of ichthyosaurs.
Oh.
The dolphin-like ones that we talked a bit about in episode 51, just a bit.
They went a slightly different direction.
They did. Now that's what we knew about it. One of the new specimens that these researchers describe has a skull, and there's a lot of very interesting things about the skull. First thing that jumps right out is that its skull is comically small. It's got this rigid body, these big broad flippers, and then this tiny little head perched between its shoulders. Even for the size of its head, it has very, very small eyes. The orbits are much reduced.
Interesting.
And this is fascinating right off the bat, because having very small eyes means that it probably had very poor vision. In general, the bigger your eyes, the better your vision. Reduced eyes you tend to see in animals that live in the dark or that are not using their eyes to get around.
This is why nice cameras have those giant lenses.
Yes, it also, and I learned this reading this, in water, according to these researchers, the smaller your head, the harder time you have hearing things.
Oh, that completely makes sense, but I don't think I ever would have just made that connection.
Yep, because sound localization is harder in the water. Bigger heads are better for hearing, and this animal doesn't show any evidence of a specialized ear structure, so it probably also didn't have very good hearing, which leads to the question of what were they doing?
Running into stuff.
Just thump.
Nope. There we go.
Which is exacerbated by the fact that their snout is split into what are called crura. Now, I don't know how many of our listeners have ever seen a platypus skull. I think Will has seen a platypus skull because we had one in the collections. The bones of the platypus's snout look like the mandibles of a big scary beetle.
Yes.
They're like 2 hooks with a gap in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
The face isn't shaped like that, right? That is covered with a bill, but the skull is like these 2 hooks. Those are called crura, the left and right crura. This animal had that.
That's awesome.
Similar split. And even, like the platypus, had a strange bone in the middle of it that was probably supported by cartilage. And we don't know what that was doing. But it's got the same face structure as platypuses, which is really weird.
That's cool.
So they were wondering if this animal was perhaps living like a platypus. Now, platypuses, sniff around on the bottom of their watery abodes.
Mm-hmm.
And they're using, I believe, mechanical sense, but also they're electroreceptive.
Yes. One of the only non-fish to do that.
Yes, indeed. So the researchers investigated a little more of the animal's senses of Eretmoripus, this ancient reptile. They found no specialized structure for smelling, and indeed pointed out that because of the structure of its nose, it probably wasn't a good smeller. It did not have a vomeronasal fenestra, which is to say a gap in the skull bones that opens into the vomeronasal organ, which is, if you think of a snake, when they flick their tongue out and collect scents, that's where they're dropping that off to be sensed by that organ. Snakes do it, some lizards do it. This animal did not have that capability, it seems, so it probably wasn't tongue flicking or anything like that. So they conclude that it was most likely tactilely sensing things. It was searching for things by its sense of feel. We do not have any evidence one way or the other as to whether or not it was electroreceptive. I don't know of any fossil proxy for that. And also, if I remember right, the study said that has not been observed in reptiles.
Yeah.
So it would be, it's not out of the question, but it would be a strange thing. Then again, it's like a platypus. So,
yeah. It's following a good role model if it's going for setting strange precedents. That's very interesting. That's really cool.
Yeah, they conclude that it was probably foraging for small critters like arthropods and stuff, perhaps in low-light environments.
Makes sense. That's fast. The fact that it's so similar is just completely stunning. Like,
it's so weird.
It's a weird thing to convergently evolve, and it's also unexpected to see a reptile do it so closely to a mammal.
It's
like,
striking.
That is really, really interesting. And it's one of those where, were Jurassic Park to make it, it would absolutely have the electroreceptors.
Of course. It would shoot electricity.
Because those are literally skin deep. Like, electroreceptors, even on like sharks, are just the outer layer of skin. There's not big organs. So it'd be almost impossible to identify. Just the fact that it is using so many of the similar body designs of big paddled feet and the low eyesight.
It did not have a paddly tail. It had a short tail.
Well, you win some, you lose some.
I like that you said that it went a different way from its, like, the sister group, the ichthyosaurs, went dolphin-shaped, and this group was like, hey, we have an idea. I bet this is going to be a winner.
See, I get a picture of them, like, if ever we figure out how to, like, time travel these animals to today, they're going to get here and be like, well, they stole our thing!
Now, the authors also point out, very interestingly, this is the earliest known amniote, that is reptile mammal group, that shows reduced eyesight and non-visual hunting.
Oh.
Which is cool. And several other marine reptiles were known to inhabit the lagoon that this lived in. So they're suggesting that perhaps its super specialized habits were a form of what we call niche partitioning, where you avoid
another one of my favorite terms.
Yeah, it's good. You avoid competing with your neighbors by eating things or eating in ways or finding food or hunting at times that no one else is doing it.
Yep.
And they also make the point that this is the early Triassic, and there's kind of been this long-running suggestion, if you remember episode 45, the very start of the Triassic was not a great time, and it's been long thought that diversity probably lagged, that it took a little while for life to start diversifying. This is a surprisingly derived, right, different organism for a time where we have proposed that generally animals were not doing great.
Yeah, that things were kind of stagnant, recovering from the extinction.
So Eretmoripus is surprising and cool and weird and wonderful.
I already think it's adorable.
It's pretty great.
That's awesome. Well, speaking of the early Triassic and interesting early ancestors to some groups of reptiles, I have one from Antarctica for my next bit of news.
Oh.
Basically from the same time. This is directly after the Permian extinction that this animal is dated to. But this is an early Triassic archosaur. Archosaur contains crocodilians and dinosaurs and their surrounding cousins, discovered in Antarctica, and also sheds some of that light on the fact that, first off, gives a little bit of information on the dispersal of archosaurs during this time, and also the rate of evolution during this time. Very similar to our weird platypusy reptile.
Cool.
The research we're looking at is by P. Cook et al. In the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, the JVP, and the article we'll be linking to is Ashley Strickland in CNN Space and Science. So, once again, Antarctica, as we discussed in episode
11.
Antarctica was not always cold and ice-covered. It was fairly temperate and even warm during much of the Mesozoic, and during this time especially, in the Triassic, it was still part of Pangaea, and would have been directly attached to Africa and India and Australia.
Right. Perfect for dispersing across continents.
Everyone's moving everywhere. So we already know that Antarctica had diverse life, and, we found dinosaurs there, we found others, but we still don't know a lot about it because it's under ice. So every fossil we find opens up that picture a little bit more. Well, this new archosaur from 250 million years ago cracks the door open slightly further for a little bit of light to come through. This is Antarctinax shackletoni. This has an awesome name. The first part,
Antarctinax,
translates to Antarctica King.
Yeah, and it sounds like a transformer.
It does, right? The second name is for Ernest Shackleton, who was an Antarctic explorer.
Yeah, and an
famous.
Order in the Order of the Phoenix.
Now, this was not a big king of Antarctica. This was about iguana-sized.
Mm-hmm.
And as a early archosaur, at a layman's glance, would have been very lizard-esque, but was not sharing many of their features. So we're definitely looking at a distant relative and ancestor to the whole dinosaur crocodilian group. And this one, like all the best versions of those mentioned, also appears to be predatory.
Of course.
So probably going for little stuff, in the water and little creatures around. Maybe even early ancestors to mammals. Yeah, it's always nice to picture them getting hunted.
What were they doing back then? Thinking about becoming platypuses.
Yes.
They were looking at the water going, hey, that guy's got the right idea.
You eat me today, but soon I will be so weird that my heels will sting you. Now, some of the notable aspects of this discovery is just how it furthers the data about these early archosaurs in this area. Similar to the situation with the Retmoripus, this shows that archosaurs were not quite as stunted during this early period of the Triassic as we had thought. Now, we knew that throughout the Triassic, archosaurs were one of the groups that bounced back best, obviously because it led to the rise of dinosaurs and the age of reptiles throughout the Mesozoic. But this is early Triassic, and before the Triassic in the Permian, archosaurs were really only found around the equator.
Mm-hmm.
This is Antarctica.
Yeah.
So this is nowhere near the equator anymore. It's not as far away as it is now, but getting further and further south. So they've already dispersed this far within the beginnings of the Triassic.
Which is pretty fascinating.
That's really interesting. Now, this other little part, they don't have a direct answer for or something to draw from it, but it's not that similar to the archosaurs around this time that have been found in South Africa, which was attached to Antarctica. So something about Antarctica was making a unique collection of animals, a unique environment, even compared to nearby portions of Pangaea. So
interesting.
A little bit more on the picture of what Antarctica was like, and it's still a weird place.
Yes.
But archosaurs seem to be doing much better in early Triassic than the general thought process would lend you to believe.
I wonder if that is due to the fact that they rebounded more quickly after the Permian extinction, or if we have underestimated their geographic widespreadedness in the Permian. Like maybe they were already there.
Mm-hmm.
perhaps more early studies on Antarctica will find that.
Yeah, they may have already had some of this dispersal. It'd be very interesting. It'd be very interesting to figure out exactly why they seem to have taken over so quickly.
The Triassic was such a weird and wacky time.
Yeah.
It's so cool. Well, my next bit of news is going to go back even further than that. And I think, is that a trend? What was your first news about? I already forgot.
Mice from 9 years ago.
That's right. We're going back in time. Mice from 9 years ago. This next
We're going to push it back slightly further than that.
We're going to push it back 407 million years minus 9. To the famous Rhynie Chert in Scotland, where researchers have discovered some absolutely fascinating microfossils. And when I say microfossils, I'm not talking microvertebrates like it when we say at the Gray Fossil Site with, snake vertebrae and mice teeth. I mean microfossils. These are fossil amoebae.
That's awesome.
From Scotland. This is research by Christine Struludurian et al. In Current Biology, and we'll link to the article by Josh Davis on the Natural History Museum of London's Science News section, which may or may not be sort of press releasey. It probably is. These researchers are all from the museum. The Rhynie Chert in Scotland is a super famous fossil locality. It dates to the early Devonian period, and it represents a very early terrestrial ecosystem. So this is a time period, right? There are the tetrapods, vertebrates haven't quite made it onto land yet, but there are some very early vascular plants, little, maybe a couple feet tall at best plants, lots of invertebrates, worms and insecty type things. But the Rhynie Chert is this sort of, it's described in the article as a sort of geothermal wetland that was constantly flooded with this silica-rich water that preserves microscopic fossils. So on top of plants and animals, researchers have also found fossils of fungi and green algae and cyanobacteria, which has given us a really great insight into this early terrestrial ecosystem. So these researchers have been exploring the environment of the Rhynie Chert to examine what the earliest ecosystems in soils were like. They were focused, at least the main author here, Struludurian, comments that her studies are often focused on fungal relationships. What were fungi doing around the time that the first non-bacterial organisms were making it up onto land? But while researching this, they found little, what are called tests. So, second episode of Spotlight, we talked with Adrian Lamb, who studies foraminifera. And the reason that foraminifera are so common in the fossil record is because they're microscopic organisms that make little shells for themselves. Diatoms do this. Mm-hmm. Those are sometimes called tests.
Yeah, we mentioned in the micropaleontology episode 2.
Yes, we did, episode 22. These are shaped like vases, and they have a little hole where the tentacle-like pseudopod structures stick out of testate amoeba cells. Amoebae, to pluralize it, are single-celled organisms, and what makes them interesting in comparison to the cyanobacteria or the fungi that the researchers have found is that they are phagotrophic, which means they eat by engulfing other organisms into themselves. These tests that they found, they identified as part of a family called the Arselinidae, and they identified them as a new genus and species named Paleoleptoclamys haasii. Each of these is roughly 50 microns across. To put that into perspective, that's really, really small.
That's a whole 50 microns.
That's half as much as 100 microns. In the place where they found them, these shallow pond environments, either freshwater or brackish, which is to say, a little salty or occasionally salty, they were also buried in and among filaments of cyanobacterial mats, which could very well be what they were eating.
Yeah.
which is cool. It's not every day you find a fossil organism buried in a pile of its food.
Dung beetles.
That is a very good point. These are cool for all sorts of reasons. So what does it mean to find an amoeba or several in ancient soils? First of all, this family of testate amoebae, the oldest known fossils up until this, are Permian.
Wow.
So this is about 150 million year extension into the past. There are similar tests known from much, much earlier than this, as far back as 800 million years ago. Not the same family, but similar lifestyles, it seems, which suggests that these amoebae, this style of life, may have done the same thing that a lot of animals and plants did, and transitioning from ocean to freshwater to land. That these were now living in soils associated with fresh water.
Cool.
And my favorite part, and probably the most exciting part of this, these microorganisms, just like the fungi, just like the cyanobacteria, are extremely important for terrestrial environments. Right? You hear about how, when you talk about the little things like, earthworms are so important because they cycle the soil. These amoebae are a huge part of nutrient cycling. So taking important materials, nitrogen and things like that, and moving them through the cycle that goes on through the organisms, dispersing around the soil. Extremely important for making those nutrients available for other organisms in the ecosystem to make use of, including plants. So the researchers point out that there is a very good chance that these sorts of microorganisms, these amoebae, were important contributors to creating the soil ecosystems that would have been necessary for plants to move in the first place. And of course, it goes without saying, I think, that plants moving up onto land would have been a prerequisite for later complex animals to eventually move in and form bigger terrestrial ecosystems.
It's microbe terraforming.
Yeah, it is. And evidence for it is super rare because they're microbes. They're single-celled organisms, and this is super cool to find.
Nice. That's very cool. And it's worth noting that modern day soils are full of these examples. The fungus that are critical for plants to function and be as healthy as they are just often gets overlooked because you never see it above the ground. And if you look under the ground without a microscope, you're not going to see it there either.
Nope.
And the list goes on and on of those examples. Seeing that this dynamic was potentially set up very, very early on makes sense, but is also really cool and significant. This isn't something that it probably became more complex with more players and more things in the soil doing jobs, but it wasn't that like plants came up and then stuff started getting weird in the soil.
No, it was like that when we got here.
And that's cool.
It also, we were talking about making predictions earlier. Apparently, it also lines up with what genetic studies have found that estimate that these kinds of amoebae, these kinds of microorganisms, moved onto land alongside the earliest plants, which is something that we also see in fungi. So, like, the move to land wasn't like plants went up and now we are here. It was an entire ecosystem gradually shifted up onto the land.
Plants came onto land and brought their whole posse with them.
The whole thing. They had to have the groundwork. Or the amoebae, really, it's protozoans and bacteria moved onto land, and they tested it out first.
These are all the different ways it's being described within the different department meeting rooms of the plants, the fungus and the microbes. It's like, well, we all appreciate how hard the plants work, but come on, without us amoebae, we all know we wouldn't have made it. So we're not going to down on what they do, but yeah, come on. And the plants on the other side going, hey, we were happy to pave the way for the amoeba and the fungus. We had to do what we had. And just every different room arguing.
Well, there's some fascinating evolution and ecology for you. And you know who was into evolution and ecology, Will?
Oh.
That's right. Alfred Russell Wallace was. So we're going to take this opportunity to wrap up the news and move on to our main topic of discussion. After the little musical interlude, we will be joined by Dr. Sarah Bray to discuss the life and times of famed scientist Alfred Wallace. Stay tuned.
Woohoo!
Hello, Sarah.
Hey, David. Hey, Will.
Hello!
Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about Wallace with you guys.
Yes, we are here to talk, as we mentioned earlier in the episode, we are here to talk about a famous person named Wallace. But first, before we introduce Wallace, if you wouldn't mind to please introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Sarah Bray, and I am a professor of biology at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. It's a small liberal arts college, and I'm happy to say I think since the last time I talked to you guys, we have officially adopted a bat as our mascot. So
Yes!
Ooh, very nice.
pretty excited about it. It's the Raffinass bat. I don't remember if we had last time I had talked to you guys.
I remember you talking about them wanting to. I don't know if they had.
Yeah, so we're legit now. Although the drawing to me looks a little bit more like the Bacardi rum bat than, the Raffinass bat, but, we'll roll with it.
Oh, that's shoddy.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, so I'm a ecologist and teach ecology, evolution, most of the organismal courses. With my focus is on plants, and found out about you guys because David had listened to the podcast that I'm on, which is Discovering Darwin.
Yes, a very good podcast that all of our listeners should check out.
Please do.
And indeed, longtime listeners will remember that way back in episode 28, Sarah joined us for a discussion about Charles Darwin in celebration of Darwin Day. And now, in the year 2019, Darwin Day is upon us again. So we have brought Sarah back. Sarah, you are actually the first person in the history of the Common Descent podcast to get 2 full guest episodes.
Woohoo!
Yep.
So we are very excited to have you.
I feel
return.
like an SNL return host now.
yeah, very much like that. We're going to let you do a monologue.
Oh, okay.
Spoilers for our listeners, by the way. Sarah will not be the last to join us multiple times.
Oh.
But we get ahead of ourselves. So Darwin Day, as a quick reminder for everybody, is a celebration of the work of Charles Darwin. Darwin is kind of a big deal if you're into biology and evolution. As we discussed back in episode 28, he was a remarkable scientist. He contributed a whole lot to our modern understanding of biology, and he's more than a little bit of a role model for scientists today. So on Darwin Day, biology fans spend the day geeking out and having special events and stuff. Darwin, of course, famous for introducing us to much of our modern understanding of how evolution works. Descent with modification by means of natural selection. And if you need to know more about that, go check out episode 28 and or listen to Discovering Darwin, hosted by Dr. Sarah Bray and friends. But Darwin's had his episode. That's not who we're here to talk about today. Sarah, please, if you would, tell our listeners, who is this guy named Alfred Russell Wallace?
Yes. So Alfred Russell Wallace was a contemporary of Darwin. He's a little bit younger than Darwin. And he was sort of a middle-class man who actually had his formal education stop at about 14. But he was a really excited amateur naturalist, and went on pretty extreme journeys to Amazon, and at the time was called the Malay Islands. And about the same time, in some ways, we can talk about that in more detail later, Wallace also had similar ideas about the mechanism of natural selection to explain the origin of species. And so he went on to do lots of other things in his life, some controversial, some pretty interesting. But he's a guy that doesn't, he always gets kind of mentioned as a footnote to Darwin.
Mm-hmm.
Right. He's sort of the other guy. The
Exactly.
other guy that talked about evolution.
Yeah.
And if you liked Darwin, check out Wallace.
Yeah,
Yeah,
look,
exactly.
Users who liked Darwin
Yes.
also liked.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, the famous story, and we'll get more into this, but the famous story, of course, is that Darwin, and we actually mentioned this in our Darwin episode, that Darwin worked for decades on this research, this crazy idea of his, and then got a letter one day from Wallace, and Wallace said, "Hey, I had this wacky idea that organisms like develop new species over time by divergence of traits," and Darwin kind of freaked out about
He absolutely did.
it. So, over the course of the episode, we'll hopefully get a chance to talk a bunch about Wallace's personal life and his work. But let's start with his journey to the understanding of evolution. And we will, along the way, be discussing Wallace sort of in comparison and contrast to Darwin a little bit, because that is Wallace's curse.
Right.
To be eternally compared to Darwin. So go ahead. Yeah, Sarah, how did Wallace get started on the journey that would eventually lead him to this grand discovery?
Right. So, in 1848, Wallace decided that it was time to take a trip to the Amazon. He had been collecting beetles in the UK, in the United Kingdom, and felt that he could never answer any good questions without collecting a broader array from more places. So that was one of his motivations. The other was that he was going to make money by traveling and collecting specimens to be sold to museums and to collectors at the time. It was a really hot thing in the Victorian era to kind of have your own curios of collections.
Okay. This was something that Darwin used to call people out for as well in that time, is say, "Hey, go collect things and I'll repay you for it."
Absolutely. Yeah. And eventually, actually, so Wallace's first journey was to the Amazon, and he actually went with Bates, who people may know from Batesian mimicry, that Bates explains why it is that butterflies, for example, might mimic another poisonous species. So they actually went together. So they went on a ship together, two pretty now known as great naturalists, but just kind of young guys that wanted to go on an adventure. And went to the Amazon, and they did collect for a while together. But what's kind of funny is that at a certain point, I think there got to be a little bit of turf battle, actually, and this fear that they needed to split up the Amazon so that they were not, collecting against, if you will, against one another. And so they parted ways for a while, actually, when they were in the Amazon.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting, but they still continued to keep in contact while they were there. So, Wallace is doing a lot of collecting in the Amazon, is starting to discussing the idea of where do species come from, and the idea that species are always appearing, and that species must come from other species. And I think, when we all talked last year, we talked about that it wasn't that no one was thinking about, hey, maybe species come from other species. It was in the zeitgeist at the time. What nobody really had forwarded in a super clear way or well-reasoned way was, what is the mechanism? So it was clear it was a question that Wallace had during this journey. And so this is kind of a parallel to Darwin, right? Darwin went on his big grand journey on the Beagle when he was a young man. And they didn't cross the same land necessarily, but they had some similar experiences of really roughing it, getting to know some native peoples, and doing lots and lots of collecting.
Nice. And they were, if I remember right, Wallace and Darwin were both inspired by some of the same popular writings about this question of how does life change and where do species come from?
Yes, absolutely. So, they had both read Vestiges of Creation, which was kind of one of the first to try to give a mechanism to where species had come from. They were both influenced by Malthus, who talked about that resources grow at a linear rate, but populations grow exponentially, and that causes the struggle for existence. So they were reading a lot of the same people. They both were in love with Humboldt, who was, a naturalist of a generation before them, really. And so it's really interesting looking at both their journals that they will refer back to Humboldt's writings.
Very cool. So Wallace went on this grand epic journey through the forests, and that's something that I think I when I picture these sort of Victorian era gentlemen of science, there's sort of that proper sitting at home and playing with my jars and things, but like Darwin, Wallace traveled up and down Amazon rivers and spent years out in the wilderness doing some hardcore naturalizing.
Absolutely. Yeah, he was in Brazil for 4 years by the time that he went home. So, and he'd actually convinced his youngest brother, Herbert, to come basically apprentice with him, like, hey, come learn to be a naturalist and we can cover more ground. And in 1851, so Bates had been there almost, 3 years. I'm sorry, I said it again. Wallace had been there almost 3 years. His brother actually fell ill, and they were not together at the time. And by the time Wallace got there, his brother had already passed away. So it was a hard place to live. And Wallace himself became very ill when he returned to where his brother was staying. So it was a pretty difficult place for European Victorian men to try to make their way through the forest. And Wallace even makes fun of himself at one point in some of his writings about how silly he must look with all his clothes, and as he's watching the native peoples that are not wearing that many clothes, and he recognizes how it's so much more logical for being in this kind of environment. Which that's something I appreciate about Wallace. That's a pretty enlightened point of view for a Victorian man of that time.
You mentioned before that one of Wallace's big driving forces for collecting, right? Obviously he was doing it because he is a researcher and he wants to collect stuff, but he's also selling his collections.
Right.
Which is a dramatic difference from Darwin. That Darwin never needed money from anybody, except I guess Dad.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah, Darwin really was the half of the top of the 1%. And so he ran around with a letter of credit essentially from his dad that he could just go to any bank and get money. Wallace was hustling to really do his thing, and so he had an agent in England, Stevens, that he would send specimens and letters to occasionally, and then he would get a letter of credit back from that would kind of allow him to do the next thing. But even when he was ready to come home, it was a question of, okay, can I send enough stuff back to get enough money to get on a boat to go home?
Right.
And then I think most people know about most famously of his Amazon journey was really his return trip. If anybody knows anything usually about his experience in the Amazons, the return trip, which he leaves in July of 1852 on the Helen, heading to England, heading home. He's really excited about coming home. And the ship catches fire. And Wallace runs into his cabin, saves a watch and a shirt, I believe it was, and loses 500 pounds worth of specimens and all his journals. He had both live and preserved specimens, so he had these monkeys and a parrot, and he loses all of this, which, he was going to use to make money to go on to do his next thing. So here they are on their little life rafts in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and they're going to try to make for Bermuda, which is 700 miles away.
Wow.
They do get picked up by another ship, which also looks like it's about to sink anytime. And eventually he makes it home. He was at sea for 80 days.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, there should be a Wallace movie.
There should. He lived a life, I'm telling you.
It's always funny to me to think about, because I've heard this story, and it's first of all a moment of silence for 500 pounds of specimen.
Yes.
Ugh.
Yes.
But also that it always seemed silly to me when I was younger to hear of a ship catching fire.
Mm-hmm.
Because my first thought is, well, you're in the ocean, but that also means that there's literally nowhere to go.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That's at least when your house catches fire.
You can run outside.
Like, you can run outside and the fire department can get to you. Like,
yeah.
That's rough.
Yeah.
And yet, Tenacious Wallace published on his stuff that he worked on.
Absolutely.
In the Amazon.
He did. So he had two main books that came out of his time in the Amazon. Travels on the Amazon, which was, a travel log, was kind of similar to Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. It was meant to be a popular travel log. And the other thing he wrote was a book on palms. One of the things that he was interested in was he had gotten Hooker, who was the conservator of Kew Gardens, to kind of vouch for him, and he was going to buy some specimens from Wallace. And one of the things they were really interested in was this palm that was heavily exported, but it was coming from way up the Amazon River. And so they didn't really, know for sure what this palm was. So he did really focus a lot on palms and wrote a book. Hooker ravaged him about this book. He was pretty nasty about it. It got mixed reviews. Like, some people said this was a nice addition, but it's this interesting theme throughout Wallace's life about his relationship with Hooker, that Hooker did kind of give him some of the gravitas that allowed him to go on this trip and get entryway into a lot of places, but Hooker was always kind of putting him down until pretty late in Wallace's life when he did actually come around. So we may see appearances of Hooker in and out of his life as we move forward.
that contentious scientific community.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
that we're so familiar with.
Yes. And I think for poor Wallace, that some of this is about class, and it's about his lack of formal education that really made it harder for him to get acceptance within the scientific community that he worked for his entire life.
Yeah. Now, Wallace's grand thoughts on what would become evolutionary theory did not happen, at least the pinnacle of them did not happen in Brazil.
Correct.
He didn't stop with Brazil. Even after almost dying in a fire and then almost drowning and losing years of work.
Exactly. Yeah, so
he said, you know what I want to do? I want to go back out.
Exactly. It didn't take him that long to decide that he wanted to hit the road again, hit the seas again. So he returned home in 1852. By 1854, he was sending letters to the Admiralty to try to get them to pay for his trip to Singapore. So
Nice.
He was wanting to head to what is now Indonesia, what at that time was called the Malay Islands. And yeah, he did manage to get to the Admiralty to pay his way there. And this time he takes an apprentice with him, an English apprentice, that he is gonna, not his brother, no relative this time, that he is gonna train up and hopefully not lose or die in the forest. And so he really spends the next over 4 years island hopping essentially throughout Indonesia. And
Wow.
yeah, the big thing that was so important to him was the fact that he was moving from island to island and was noticing these really distinct distributions of organisms. And one of the first times that hit him was when he was going from the island of Bali to the island of Lombok, which are separated by only less than 30 kilometers of a strait of water. And he noticed that, and I'll just quote the man directly here, he noticed that the fauna belonged to two quite distinct zoological provinces, of which they form the extreme limits. So he starts seeing these really distinct distributions, paying a lot of attention to biogeography, and starts to think, well, the only way this could really be explained is through this idea of descent with modification that leads you to these kind of localized distributions of organisms.
Cool.
It's one of the sort of foundational principles of evolution that I think gets less attention. It's always down the list when I hear people talk about evidences for evolution is biogeography.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is simply the way organisms are arranged.
Right.
And I think it's really telling that Wallace, like Darwin, spent time on islands.
Yes.
That's exactly what I was about to say, is the fact that islands played a important role in both formations of the idea. It goes to show how important that clue is and how active natural selection is across islands, which is cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Wallace has this species notebook that he kept that while he was in Indonesia. And in this, he has some quotes actually from Voyage of the Beagle, where Darwin is talking about the Galapagos. So there's a lot of connection there in terms of how he's thinking about these islands and what Darwin was also thinking.
Cool. In fact, the first 3 episodes of the Common Descent podcast were obligatory topics. They were paleontology, then it was Will's animals, then it was my animals. The first non-obligatory topic, actually, that we did, episode 4, was island evolution.
Awesome.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was.
All the way back, listeners. And
You've
we'll
been hearing it.
tell you about why islands are so crazy.
Yeah.
There's a reason that was an easy topic to pick as our first random subject.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, this is I actually find his time in Indonesia so interesting because, like you guys were saying, this idea of this, Victorian scientist, you expect him to be sitting, at home with his specimens. But man, he went to some crazy places, lived in some crazy places, had crazy things happen to him. But he did kind of have a few home bases at various times, and would, go back and get resupplied. And there's just a few scenes of him sitting in this hut where, well, I must have my tea, So there's certain things a British gentleman cannot go without, no matter where one is.
That's fantastic.
I'm sure there's something to be said about you can take the proper Victorian British gentleman away from England, but you can't take the England out of the proper Victorian British gentleman.
Cannot take the tea from the man.
Well, we're here to do important science, but that doesn't mean we have to throw all reason out the window.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah, right.
Come on.
So it was in those journeys that he came up, and the story of the alleged story of him coming to this idea is also very funny.
Yeah, so there's really two big things that he does in terms of forwarding his ideas of evolution while in Indonesia. And so there's 2 papers, and they're named by, they have actual names, but most people discuss them by where he wrote them. So the first one is the Sarawak paper, which was written on the Sarawak River on the island of Borneo. And that one was on the law which has regulated the introduction of new species. And in that, he really just lays out his agreement with the idea that, species arise from other species. So just, a couple quotes maybe to kind of illustrate that. He says, "Every species has come into existence coincident both in time and space with a pre-existing closely allied species." So seeing the connection between, organisms of similar groups seem to have had a common ancestor. He also says that his theory explains the natural system of arrangement of organic beings, their geographical distribution, their geological sequence, the phenomena of representative and substituted groups in all their modification, and the most singular peculiarities of atomical structure. So those are all, lines of evidence that we have all seen as evidence of, common descent. So he's really laying out kind of the groundwork. He stated a theory, but he has no mechanism. Like Darwin, he also came up with like a tree metaphor of how species arise. And so that was kind of the first one, and that was early on. The second one that you were talking about, David, is often called the ternate paper. And of course, like I said, Wallace had many adventures. He had a terribly sprained ankle. It abscessed. He had all kinds of rashes. But this particular paper arose from what was a bout of malaria. And he was really very ill, highly fevered. And this is the letter that he did send to Darwin eventually. And so this is where he now lays out the idea of natural selection. And that is the one that made Darwin terrified.
Yeah.
Yes.
That he was going to lose his priority.
Poop his pants just a bit.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was a fever dream. The way that the story often goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a fevered state,
Yeah.
he was struck by this inspiration.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I think that's one where, we've created a big hoopla around it. When you look back at his species notebook, he's been playing with these ideas over this time. I think it was that what often happened with Wallace while he was traveling is that anytime he did get ill so that he couldn't do things, that's when he would write, because he couldn't collect.
Okay.
So it was
Makes sense.
Probably a function of him being unable to do anything else, that once he got at least a little bit lucid, he's like, well, I'll just write down some of these ideas finally.
Yeah, stuck in bed, can only think.
Yep, exactly. I can identify with that. So the other big thing that, really came out of this travel for Wallace is unlike the Amazon, it was much more lucrative because he didn't have anything go down in a blazing fire of ship. His last shipment back to Stevens before he came back himself was in 1857. And he sent back 9,000 specimens of 1,600 different species. And
wow.
It was worth, he ended up getting 1,000 pounds for that, which was a really huge, pretty big sum of money in a lump sum at that time. And the other big thing is Wallace was obsessed with finding birds of paradise and collecting those.
Who wouldn't?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. For all your listeners out there, if you haven't seen them, do a quick Google. The Cornell lab has just fabulous videos of the courtship of these birds, and they are spectacular.
Mm-hmm.
So he spent a lot of time collecting those. He actually ended up, before he left, he had 3 people working for him. Also, he would buy things from natives to try to get it. And then his other big thing was he was collecting a lot of orangutans. So,
wow.
Many Victorian naturalists, you just think of him decimating the flora and fauna where he goes through.
Well, there is the famous story that I've read for him, and I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to bring it up for Will, because I know Will has a special orangutan shaped place in his heart.
Yes, I do.
The story that I read is that Wallace temporarily adopted a baby orangutan, which sounds all adorable and wonderful, but he adopted it because he killed its mother.
Oh.
Yes.
To collect her.
And then the baby died eventually too, because he couldn't.
Because he didn't know how to take care of an orangutan, yeah.
So wait, you're saying that he has the same relationship with that orangutan as Thanos with the Gamora. Just throwing it out there.
Well, when you put it that way. Listen, he had to give up something he loved in order to gain the theory of evolution.
What did it cost?
What did it cost?
Oh, man.
But anyway, so Wallace, extremely successful across Indonesia, across islands. We could talk a little bit more later on about sort of the other scientific ideas that came out of those trips. But let's, just to change things up, let's talk about Darwin for a second.
Sure.
Finally.
So eventually, as you mentioned, Wallace reaches out to Darwin with this idea that he had, with this paper he wrote. What was the relationship leading up to that?
Yeah, so I mentioned that Wallace had written this Sarawak paper that kind of staked his claim for stating that species arose through common descent. And Darwin read it and was actually pretty dismissive of it. His own writing about it says, "Nothing very new here. Uses my simile of the tree. It seems all creation with him." So Darwin's first was like, whatever, Wallace.
Never gonna hear from that guy again.
Yeah, exactly. Lyell, right, the geologist who inspired, again, both Darwin and Wallace, actually he didn't call him up. He wrote him up, came and visited.
He pigeoned him.
Yeah. And said, this guy, hey, he's got something going on. I think you need to get moving on your idea here, because this guy is on your tail. And so Darwin just was, kind of like, oh, all right. I'll write him back. And so their first really relationship then was that, Darwin knew he was in Indonesia and said, hey, like he did to so many other naturalists, could you send me some specimens? So Darwin writes to Wallace for the first time in 1855 and basically gives him a list of things he wants. There's a few different cases where Wallace is sending things back to his agent, Stevens. And so this one in particular, he said, the domestic duck is for Mr. Darwin, and he would perhaps like to take the jungle cock, which is often domesticated here and is doubtless one of the originals for the domestic breed of poultry. And, one thing that was a little bit different between Darwin and Wallace is Darwin started his argument with talking about domestication and artificial selection. And so it's just so interesting that theme is already there in their relationship from the very beginning.
I saw this duck and I thought of you.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. I like to imagine it's funny that, because Wallace knew of Darwin, right? Darwin was not yet Darwin,
right?
But he was a scientist,
yeah, absolutely.
And it seems very much like Wallace reaching out to Darwin is very much akin to us reaching out to you, Sarah.
Yeah.
For this, where it's like, oh, here's a seasoned scientist who knows this topic, and we'll reach out to them for information.
Right.
And so it's sort of this collaborative relationship almost, which is just two scientists talking to each other, except via letters from the other side of the world.
Yeah. Instead of LinkedIn, it was the post.
Yeah, and crazy. Think about the delays you would have in terms of you send off a letter and it takes months to reach the other person, and then months for them to send you something back. It's an interesting conversation that they're having.
Yeah. It's like communicating with Curiosity on Mars.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I think for Wallace, Darwin was really well known. He was really famous from writing The Voyage of the Beagle, and he kind of saw this as his way into quote unquote legitimate, science society, if he could get this relationship going with Darwin. And so, after that, they continue to exchange letters while Wallace is in Indonesia. And in 1857, Wallace receives a letter from Darwin that it seems to show now at this point Darwin is concerned that Wallace is on the same path. And so one thing he says, I agree to the truth of almost every word of your paper. And that's about that Sarawak paper that I was talking about. But the really fun part is where I feel like Darwin is calling dibs in his letter. And he says, this is Darwin writing to Wallace. This summer will make the 20th year, ! Since I opened my first notebook on the question how and in what way do species and varieties differ from each other. I am now preparing my work for publication, but I find the subject so very large that though I have written many chapters, I do not suppose I shall go to press for 2 years. I have never heard how long you intend on staying in the Malay archipelago. I wish I might profit from the publication of your travels there before my work appears, for no doubt you will reap a large harvest of facts.
Interest. That's really,
Wow.
really fascinating.
It's like,
That's not subtle.
no, it's
No.
like, girl, step off. I've been working on this.
Yeah.
It's
and
like,
I don't know how long
that's-
you're staying, but this is mine.
That's a cool idea. In fact, it's so
Yeah,
cool.
right?
I've
It's-
been working on it for 20 years.
Reminds me of that time I spent my entire life coming up with this idea that I'm about to publish.
Yeah. So yeah, clearly Darwin's getting a little antsy here, but the best part is Wallace, it seemingly, at least in what we have left of his writings, is kind of oblivious. He doesn't like really see that and say, oh, Darwin's doing this already, I should just let it go. Because that was in 57. And then in March 1858 is when he writes the ternate letter that I was talking about. And this is the one that's on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type. And that's where he proposes natural selection. So, I'm not sure what date he received that letter in 57, but it's certainly within a year anyway, after the territorial marking by Darwin peeing all over natural selection.
Yep.
Well, Wallace is like, well, if you liked that paper,
Yeah, here's another
you're gonna
one.
love this next one.
Exactly.
Makes me think back to your initial comparison of just the young new guy talking to an established person, just not being able to read.
Yes.
Being like, oh, sweet, they responded.
He likes me. He likes
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, we're gonna work together. He wants to publish.
Yeah, clearly. Yeah. Yeah, so just classic.
And we talked about sort of the aftermath of that a bit in our Darwin episode.
Right.
But for a brief recap, Darwin receives the letter.
Yes.
And he needs some convincing on what to do with it.
Yeah, he really freaks out. So when Darwin receives this letter from Wallace, and he's like, "Oh man, this is my thing." And the interesting thing about when Wallace sent the letter, it was like, "Oh yeah, you might be interested in this, but hey, could you pass it on to Lyle?" So he wasn't even primarily trying to get Chuck on board.
Oh, no.
Wow, like, hey, can you ask Lyle if he likes me?
Yes. Yeah.
And then
So
report.
he knew that Lyle was one of the first people who thought his first paper, the Sarawak paper, was saying something. So he's like, oh, he gets me. Could you pass that on to him? He'll be all about this.
Could you send this to Lyle? You can read it if you want to, but if you...
Yeah,
Yeah, right.
exactly. So you know, this is how Wallace receives it, and Darwin receives it, and Darwin is actually kind of in the midst of family tragedy. His son Charles is very ill, and he actually ends up passing away at the same time that he receives this. And so in Darwin's letter to Lyle, where he's like, all right, he asked me to forward this to him, I will. So that was pretty stand-up of Chuck. He says, there's nothing in Wallace's sketch which is not written out much fuller in my sketch copied in 1844 and read by Hooker some dozen years ago. About a year ago, I sent a short sketch of which I have a copy of my views to Asa Gray, so that I could most truly say and prove that I take nothing from Wallace. I should be extremely glad now to publish a sketch of my general views in about a dozen pages or so, but I cannot persuade myself that I can do so honorably. Wallace says nothing about publication, and I enclose his letter. But as I had not intended to publish any sketch, can I do so honorably because Wallace has sent me an outline of his doctrine? I would far rather burn my whole book than he or any other man should think that I have behaved in such a paltry spirit. Do you not think that his having sent me this sketch ties my hands?
That's really
Wow.
interesting.
What a conundrum.
Yeah, so Darwin's clearly freaking out, and Lyle gets together with Hooker, and they all talk about this, and they pretty quickly come up with a solution in which Wallace's letter and the sketch that Darwin talks about from 1844 would be read at the next Linnaean Society meeting. So it's at that meeting, it's introduced. They read the papers in chronological order, which technically then gives priority to Darwin because his was read first and written first.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, that's a fascinating quote from him, because a lot of the time, at least I've heard it thrown around this way a lot of the time, people kind of, once they learn about Wallace, will kind of start turning a stink eye toward Darwin. That like once he realized someone was catching up to him, immediately like threw down a wall and published and, blocked them from the goal, which you could look at it that way. But also on the flip side, if you've been working on this concept, but it's a huge paradigm shifting concept, and you're hesitant to publish on, and then some younger person who does not seem to have the same hesitation suddenly comes along and is like, hey, I had this idea. There's got to be some of that. Like, I've had this idea. I just haven't been talking a whole bunch about it because I'm still forming it. Now this is out there, and it's going to seem like I am following that when, your legitimacy as a scientist now is being dragged into it. Which, it's a complicated situation that typically you don't hear about when you hear about these two.
What we're saying, kids, is publish your thesis.
Yes.
Seriously.
Yes.
Now, we can frame it this way of it was indeed a very generous thing in part of these men to not just throw Wallace's paper in the fire and leave him in the dust. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, Wallace was not brought in on the decision to present his work because, as you said, he was days and weeks of communication away.
Right.
So he found out about it after the fact.
Absolutely, yeah. So they send him a letter. Hey, guess what? We're going to present your paper at the Linnean Society meeting. So it's done now. Hope you're okay with that. In his contemporary writing of the time, he seemed actually really, really pleased. And one of the things is that he was just so in a letter to his mother, he said that his letters were read by two of the most eminent naturalists in England, which have highly gratified me. I sent Mr. Darwin an essay on a subject upon which he is now writing a great work. He showed it to Dr. Hooker and Sir Charles Lyell, who thought so highly of it that they had it read before the Linnean Society. This ensures me the acquaintance of these eminent men on my return home.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's interesting. He's not even worried about his priority or his ideas. He's like, I got it in.
Yeah. Well,
yeah. These famous guys read it to people.
Yeah.
It'd be like if Neil deGrasse Tyson quoted your thesis during one of his interviews or talks.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be worried about him taking that chance away from you. You'd be like, he said words I said.
Exactly.
Now people know my name.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And so this was the unveiling. That event was sort of the unveiling of this descent with modification idea on a stage.
Right, exactly. Yes. And that finally, for the first time, we had a mechanism to explain why descent with modification is occurring, right? So the idea of natural selection.
And so there was evolution, right? The next year, Darwin, if I have my years correct, the next year, Darwin published his, quote, abstract.
Right.
His chapters and chapters of abstract.
Yes.
But of course, Wallace didn't stop there. Wallace continued sciencing, and we'll talk more about that. We'll come back around to that, but let's take some time and talk a bit more, as we did with Darwin, about Wallace the person, who he was, his life outside of science. And before we do that, we're going to take a very short break, and we will be back in just a moment to meet Wallace as just the guy from the UK.
Get the dude.
So, Sarah, tell us. Let's rewind. Let's go back. What was Wallace's early life like before his trips? Before all this, how did he grow up?
Right. So, it's interesting. He really was actually born to, I would say a relatively wealthy family when he was born. His father had an income of, £500 a year, which that was considerable. That was not for working. That was just, living on inheritance essentially. But then, they started having kids. Kids are expensive. And it's an interesting trait in the Wallace family that they all seem to have a really bad sense of good investments. So through a series of really poor financial decisions, Wallace's father really loses a lot of money and now has to work. The family moves frequently when he is a child. They live in Wales for a while. They land in Hertford, England, and that is where Wallace's dad starts taking in pupils to try to make money. And this is also where Wallace gets all of his formalized schooling, is when they live in Hertford. So he makes a lifelong friend, George Silk, who, appears throughout his life and is a really important confidant to him. But his formalized schooling ends at 14, basically, because there's just not enough money to continue sending him to school.
Yeah.
Wow.
So he's sent off, basically as the kids get to be about at that age, they're sent off to apprentice somewhere to learn a trade. So at 14, Wallace is sent to his older brother, John, who was apprenticed to a master builder. Later, he apprentices with his other older brother, who is William, and he becomes a surveyor. And William.
Will's making lots of... Well, this is a joke. The listeners will appreciate this, but they couldn't... It was very visual. Will reacted to the name William, but before that, he reacted to the phrase master builder.
I was going to say, William should have gone and learned to be a master builder.
Because Will is a dork. Says the guy who gets the reference.
See, that's what I want to be someday.
So now when you say surveying, Wallace was mapping.
Right, exactly. So at this time, there was a new Lands Act, and a lot of people needed to have their land surveyed. This was also a time when railways were really expanding. So there was just a lot of actual work to do this. And so for 6 years, he was a surveyor, moved around, went back to Wales. And that's really where he developed his love of naturalizing, of collecting, of, botanizing and beetlizing. I don't know. Is that a verb?
Beetling.
Beetling. There we go. And eventually he ends up in Leicester, and that's where he meets Henry Walter Bates, right? Who he goes to the Amazon with. And that's really what starts to get his itch for travel, is he hooks up with Bates. They're running all over the countryside collecting things. Bates was an avid entomologist, and that's how Wallace got then into beetles and that kind of thing. And that's where he first said, "I begin to feel rather dissatisfied with a mere local collection. Little to be learnt by it. I should like to take some one family to study thoroughly, principally with a view to the theory of the origin of species." So already from that get-go, when he gets into it, he's like, wow. I'm figuring this out.
A man on a mission.
Yeah. So that was kind of his early life. He bounced around. He was, he had a pretty hard life. So again, in comparison to Darwin, right? Darwin, super wealthy, got lots of formalized training, right? Tried to be a doctor, got grossed out by that, right? Was going to go be a little a minister, country parson, right? Got to go to University of Edinburgh, all these things. And Wallace, he just learned it himself, doing things. So really, really different ways that they ended up at the same place.
I find it fascinating that Wallace was a surveyor, because mapping and surveying, the hand in hand with the biology that leads into evolutionary science is geology.
Right.
And Darwin fancied himself a geologist and wrote about geology. And Wallace, you mentioned before, Wallace was factoring in fossil occurrences and that organisms are not only similar in space, but in time, that there's that relationship. And mapping is like the foundational starting point of geology. Like the famous early geological insights came from people like William Smith. And I hope I'm getting that name right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who did the first maps and sort of the first geologic maps of it was the UK, right? England?
Yeah.
That he did. And so that's a cool combination of skills that Wallace built up, geographizing and also collecting as a naturalist. And then he surveyed rivers when he was in the Amazon.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's that kind of groundwork, that kind of building up of the data that then can be used for future research that was done by these scientists at this time that now we can continue to build off of. It's cool that he was doing a little bit of all of it.
Yeah, that's the thing that strikes me about both these guys. I mean, I think one, the surveying, it makes me wonder if it set him up to see biogeography then more, because he was paying so much attention to place. And the other thing is just the fact that, today we tend to be very siloed within our disciplines, and these, were the true Renaissance men, that they could draw on all these different areas that just gotta feel like that's part of what allowed them to get to this place.
Yeah. I want to spend several years surveying and then several years naturalizing and then travel to the tropics on opposite hemispheres.
Well, it's because like nowadays you can go look up the information that's been done by the other people in their other fields.
Right.
Back then you didn't have that option. You couldn't just go and call the geologists. If you wanted to learn about the geology in this area, you start learning rocks, because that's your only option.
Get on a boat.
Yeah.
Until you became a boss like Darwin, and then you could just get everybody to do all those things for you.
Yes, yeah. Then you just send requests.
Yeah. I would like a duck.
Yeah.
I do like that one of their first interactions was one contact from Wallace and then basically a grocery list from Darwin.
Yeah. Right. Which is very I like that seems very much like that close approximation of Darwin taking on a student.
Yeah.
Of them being like, hey, I want to study this real cool thing. And Darwin's like, awesome, here's a menial task for you to do.
Yeah.
It'll be a learning experience.
Yeah. Here, label these bones.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Exactly.
It's a very grad student which is actually kind of cool because they were on different continents.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even need to see you. Go do this.
Yeah. Like,
yeah,
all right. All right, cool. Here's stuff you can do.
So Wallace takes this, he's sort of self-making a little bit.
Right.
He's not wealthy. He has to earn his money. He has to work, unlike some other naturalists.
Somebody else we know.
And then later in life, eventually he finishes his, gallivanting through malaria-ridden forests. What does he get into as an older man? Yeah,
so he comes back after being in the Malay archipelago, and much like Darwin, his mind gets set to marriage, right? Just like Darwin kind of did. And so he's looking for a wife, and he was courting, if you will, the daughter of a friend, the Leslie family. And so they had, he had spent a lot of time on this. They became engaged. Now, the Leslie family was socially higher and more wealthy than Wallace, and it ended up that she broke off the engagement. And Wallace was crushed, and it's interesting that in his autobiography, that Wallace spends more time talking about, quote, Miss L and his broken off engagement than he does about the woman he eventually marries.
Oh no!
So yeah, it was.
I hope she didn't read that.
Yeah, I don't know. But apparently, the way to find a wife in Victorian England was either to marry your cousin, like Darwin did, or to marry your friend's daughters, which is also... So his first engagement fell through. That was a friend's daughter, but he eventually marries Annie Mittens, who's the daughter of a botanist friend. And this seems, it was a good match. She also liked to botanize, and they had 3 children. 2 of them lived to adulthood. They seemed to have almost a hobby of building houses and gardens, and they'd get it all the way they liked it, and then they'd sell it. It's like Victorian flipping, I guess. I don't know.
That's fantastic.
Oh, that's cool.
It's nice to know that HGTV would have done well back then, too.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. So, he... throughout his life, though, he had money problems. He always was trying to get a permanent job as, a curator, generally those kinds of, curator type positions, and always got passed over. And a lot of it probably had to do with his lack of formalized education, with his social class that didn't give him access to those. And so, I think it's interesting because some of those things are still reflected in science today, right? There are certain, there's plenty of people out there that don't have advanced degrees that know so many things and are just fantastic at it, or they don't have the right degree, or again, they don't have the social capital to get to those things. So we're still we're still fighting those things today.
Yeah,
how times have changed.
Yeah, sadly.
It's only been 150 years. Give us some time.
Yeah, that's all. Come on.
Yeah,
Stop
rushing.
Wallace, so he kind of has to, his whole life, he's essentially hustling, right, to try to make money.
Every day.
Yeah, he over his lifetime wrote 1,000 articles and 22 books. And that's where, some of his income came from then, is selling of books. Some of the articles he would have been paid for. He went on a lecture circuit, including he did a tour in the United States, which was interesting. Made his way all the way out took a steamer ship to New York, played the East Coast, if you will, went on to Chicago, Denver, and then what his remaining living brother was living in California, and he made it all the way out there. So
cool.
Yeah, he was really engaged in science his whole life. So in about 1880, Darwin was a major player to try to get Wallace a pension. There were a core group of scientists who really recognized that, he had contributed a lot. He was having financial problems. And so Darwin, Hooker, and Huxley, who's known as Darwin's bulldog, basically worked with some other scientists to propose to the government that Wallace receive a pension. And in 1880, they managed to get him that. So he got a pension of £200 a year, which was not luxurious, but it was definitely enough to take some of these money pressures off of him. And
nice.
So he had that for the remaining 33 years of his life, was kind of able to not stress the same level.
So
awesome.
Sending that letter to Darwin actually did help.
It did. It did.
Like, he did make friends in the scientific circles who could help him out.
Yeah. Yeah, and notice it's Hooker was the one that kind of went to bat for him, who was slamming him on his palm book in the beginning. And when they first tried to get him this pension, one of the reasons Hooker was not actually for it, and he said the reason was some of the more, shall we say, eccentric beliefs that Wallace had. So Wallace was a well-known spiritualist, right? This was the era when people had seances and really popular, right, in the Victorian era, and most of the scientific elite thought that was poppycock, and so we're not really into that. So that was one of the main reasons Hooker was kind of resistant in the beginning. But yeah, he was really interesting in terms of his views on a lot of things. He felt that there shouldn't be any privately held land. This actually came all the way back from his surveying days, that he saw, the effect that the Land Act had on people, especially poor people. He really was very much a socialist in his views, and was also kind of the first anti-vaxxer. So we do have to have a little bit of a black mark for him there.
Yep.
Yeah, although I guess back then it was probably a bit of a new thing. I don't know the timeline off the top of my head.
Yeah, I don't. Salk and smallpox would have been the first. I don't really remember. I feel like that was 18th century though, so it would have been.
Oh, okay. All right, yeah, so anti-vaxxer then.
Well, it actually is kind of interesting because it sounds like he, from the bits of hearing about him, that he could have been one of those people that was just kind of open to lots of ideas, very, very open to just, the spiritualism things, and, the fact that he was a open-minded enough, European to recognize that the natives had better sense in clothing than he did. The concept of no private land is an out there kind of thing for people in his his society. That
is he like the rich white guy who's like, they're doing all this great stuff over from the East Asia, and they've come up with all these cool remedies and things.
Yeah,
there's a person who's a little, that can be a little too open to any sort of interesting idea, but also open enough that you come up with natural selection.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Right,
like
yes.
That he was just a very open-minded person, but he's like, oh yeah, sure, ghosts, cool. And
well, I like that you, Sarah, you drew a connection between his surveying experience and his ideas on privately held land. And I, earlier this very day, I was sitting on the periphery of a recording of a podcast of a couple of friends of ours who do A Touch of Gray, and there was a comment that I heard our surveyor at the museum, Brian, mention that sometimes surveying can be very dangerous because you end up on somebody's land and they come out with guns because they don't want you to be on their land. And that was my first thought when he was like, there should be no private land. And I'm like, who shot at you? When you were surveying across the UK.
It would make things a lot easier if it was just okay for me to go where I needed to.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. So he does become a bit notorious in his later life for some of these other ideas. Are there any others of those you want to make mention of before we start talking about his more scientific contributions?
The one thing I think, again, I would say is, post origin, there was a lot of discussion of social Darwinism going on. And this was something that Wallace did really confront. And it's interesting because he did feel that evolution was progressive and that humans were going to progress to some better elevated state, but he felt that it needed to be essentially guided in some way. And so there's some interesting kind of intelligent designy things going on there. But his response to social Darwinism was, instead of the horrible things that most social Darwinism did in the kind of eugenics line, was instead social intervention. So he was a big proponent of giving women a means of living other than marriage. So he was kind of a pseudo-feminist a little bit.
Cool. Wallace and his wacky ideas.
I know, crazy. Yeah, crazy guy. Spiritualism and women getting rights. This is nuts. But he really pressed for education for the poorer classes, seeing that as a way to raise all boats and to essentially avoid the Malthusian crush that if people were educated, they would marry later, they would have fewer children, and so we wouldn't have as much of the suffering, the Malthusian suffering, and that if we eliminate poverty, that will lead to the improvement of the race. So, meaning the human race. So I think that's notable, is that he had these pretty progressive ideas that certainly were not being embraced at the time.
Yeah, cool.
Interesting.
It's fascinating to hear about Wallace, especially. Darwin's got some of this, but a lot of famous scientists, people who spent as much time as they possibly could thinking and writing, just had all these ideas that they left behind for people to investigate.
Yeah.
And it's fun to see. It's fun to see where, and we talked about this on the Darwin episode a little bit. It's always fun to see where they were progressive and where they were very much products of their time.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, and it's one of those where, there's a lot of, like, social Darwinistic things and thinking of progressive evolution, like humans, like that. Of course, that idea popped up after this was presented to the public. You're going to apply it to everything and go, does it fit here? Does it fit here? And the thinking that it's going to constantly improve is another one of those, like, well, yeah, I mean, if it's a processes are leading somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And so you can, like, things that seem out of date backwards now, even though they were the ones coming up with the topic, it's, makes sense when it's brand new.
Yeah, absolutely.
But of course, Wallace did not stop sciencing after his journeys around the world. So what, just briefly, what are some of the other scientific works that Wallace contributed?
Yeah, so gosh, like I said, he wrote 22 books. So some of the books that he wrote the Geographical Distribution of Animals, so that was his true biogeography book. Island Life, which was, as we talked about before, everyone's fascinated with islands and what that means for evolution. He wrote a book, The Malay Archipelago, and he dedicated that to Darwin, and Darwin was just pleased as punch about that dedication. After Darwin died, he wrote the book Darwinism, in which Wallace was kind of trying to develop the ideas further there. And one of the places where Wallace and Darwin had differences scientifically about evolution and natural selection is how heritability works. And so Darwin he eventually landed on this idea of gemmules, which was this idea that there's things throughout your body that migrate then to your germ cells, and that's what causes inheritance. So and which of course we know is not the case, and it was it's kind of leaning towards acquired characters then. And Wallace didn't know, like everybody else, didn't know how heritability would work, but he's like, I don't think that's it. And one of the things he pushed for was to create an institute to study heritability. He never got it, but he was really interested in that and kind of barking up the correct tree, if you will. One of his more controversial, probably, books, or sorry, not books, but a publication was The Origin of Human Races from the Theory of Natural Selection. The reason why it was controversial, it actually, again, is this idea that he had, that he did think the civilized state would have been the more evolved, and he had ideas why the quote-unquote uncivilized places hadn't reached that point. So there was a little bit of that kind of hierarchy. But what made it particularly disturbing was that he chose to publish it in the Anthropological Society, which sounds right? It's about people. That sounds like a good place. Unfortunately, there were two main societies that were studied anthropology, and this one happened to be run by white supremacists. Ooh. Yeah, and it seems that Wallace was just kind of naive. Again, he just continually a little bit naive to things. Didn't see that. And he's like, well, my last paper I published in the other one, so it's their turn.
And they seem real excited about
it.
Nice.
Yeah, right. I had a wonderful conversation with this nice man in a white hood.
Yeah,
he was really encouraging.
So
Wallace.
The other reason seems to be that he did put a lot about sexual selection in that book, and that the original the other society that he had published in before allowed women in it, and he thought it was a little too delicate for them for mixed company. So that seems to be the other reason.
So you're saying the white supremacist society also didn't allow women in?
Right. Yes. Of course they did.
Okay.
Of course they did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Surprise.
Oh no.
Yeah. So that one, not a good choice probably, and his Huxley and Hooker and these folks were like, no, not there, Wallace, no. But he's like, no, he'll be fine.
Ask us first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ask us first.
So Wallace was just super engaged really all the way up into the end of his life in investigating all kinds of things. I don't know, what do you guys know in terms of there's just so much he's written. I'm sure you guys are aware of other things that I'm totally unaware of.
No, you have mentioned all the ones that I would have mentioned, and they're all awesome, all awesome examples.
Yeah. They're great.
They're all interesting.
Every word. The thing that I always think of in terms of sort of his scientific legacy is that he gave his name to a biogeographical division that we still talk about today, the Wallace line, which is this line he drew. Sarah mentioned before that he would go from island to island and say, here's how the organisms are different, and he established this line that basically separates the Asian side of the South Pacific from the Australian side, and said all the animals are different when you cross this, what he must have thought was some mysterious reason or perhaps even an arbitrary line down the middle that this is where the faunas are different, which we now know, going back to our tying in geology, is a plate boundary.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that it is, what you're seeing is a distinct genealogy on either side of this, what is now a fairly close together patch of islands and landmasses.
Mm-hmm.
And we still call it the Wallace line,
right,
because he's the first one to have really drawn attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is cool.
Yeah. Now, before we wrap up, one last question, and this seems to always be the thing that people wonder about Wallace. So Darwin worked real hard, Wallace worked real hard. They both, jointly kind of presented this idea that became, one of the foundational scientific theories in the world. And yet there is a Darwin Day.
Mm-hmm.
And yet Darwin gets all these podcasts about him. And Wallace sort of seems to be the guy that's a little sidelined. Sarah, why, in your opinion, why isn't Wallace as famous as Darwin? And how much of the credit does this younger man deserve?
Yeah, so my feeling on this is it comes down to two things. I think one is this difference in class and education played a serious role. Darwin was already respected. He was already of the scientific intelligentsia class, so he already had that kind of access. And I think the second thing is the fact that Darwin had fleshed it out much more completely at the point that Wallace had the idea, and then Wallace just dropped it. He just said, oh, good, Darwin's going to do it. I don't have to worry about it. There's, a couple places where he's quoted having saying, I was relieved that I was not the guy that was going to have to write this book. Whether that...
and deal with the fallout.
Yeah. So whether that was genuine or not, if that was just, a Victorian sensibility, I kind of doubt
I didn't even want to write it anyway.
Yeah.
Oh no, I'm terrible at writing books. You, I insist.
I've written 22 others, but not that one.
Yeah, I probably would have been a lot of work anyway.
Yeah.
You know what? So it's probably for the best.
But I kind of feel like there's so many things that we've even talked about tonight where he was so oblivious. I don't feel like that's one where he would go to a social convention of, oh well, I didn't really want to do it. I kind of think that was probably genuine. So I think to me it was probably that combination of class and education, which gave Darwin the advantage. The fact that he had already written so much of his book, and then Wallace just essentially acquiescing and seemingly happily giving it to Darwin. What do you guys think?
That's definitely the fleshing it out was the biggest thought I had, in that, I think it's fascinating that Wallace came up with a near identical, wording of natural selection, because to me, once again, it emphasizes and partially dispels that myth that is so often portrayed, that great scientific ideas come out from the rogue scientist with the wacky concepts and the out there beliefs. And that's, even something as revolutionary as natural selection was thought of by two scientists at the same time. So I like that, but Darwin had been collecting evidence from just about every source you could, for vestigial traits and fossils and domestication and embryology. And I mean, just, there really wasn't an angle he had not come at it from that you could back then. So it's cool that Wallace came up with the idea, but Darwin basically had it already done, just hadn't moved forward with it yet. So it's not like Darwin stole the credit in any way.
Right.
I agree with all of these things. And then I just want to point out, Sarah mentioned Wallace sort of acquiescing to it.
Mm-hmm.
And you also mentioned that one of the papers he wrote on the subject after the publication of The Origin was about Darwinism.
Yeah.
That he very much did seem to say, oh yeah, no, Mr. Darwin's theory. Like, this is his, and I helped. But he was more than happy to sort of let that. He didn't, for all of the humility that Darwin had in many respects, he also wanted to be the guy who introduced this to the world.
Oh yeah.
He may not have wanted all the attention he got for it, but that notoriety, being known as the person, for the work that he did.
Exactly.
And it wouldn't surprise me if part of that, when Darwin was traveling around the world, it really was mostly for self-gratification.
Mm-hmm.
He's having fun, he's learning things, whereas Wallace was much more business-minded, and Wallace was much more like, yeah, learning's cool and writing books is great, but I also need to eat and make money, which was so perhaps, and I haven't read very deeply into Wallace, but it wouldn't surprise me if part of the mindset was, yes, let those scientists do their writings, I need to go back to work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that sort of hindered him from what otherwise may have been going deeper into sort of vying for the spotlight there.
Well, and we referred to them both as the atypical Renaissance men earlier, but even with that, like, Darwin was much more focused. It seems just like got on a topic and was like, all right, I'm going to figure out everything about this topic that can be figured out. Well, Wallace seemed to have a many more focuses and interests, and which is, both are awesome, but if you're going to create a huge concept, you need to be working at it for 20 years, as he said in his letter.
Yeah. You look at Darwin, right? And he spent like 8 years on barnacles. So, like, this is a man who has some focus.
Yeah,
exactly.
And for very much that reason, both fascinating individuals. If I want a movie about either one of them, it's Wallace.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because it seems like every several years of that guy's life was something cool or terrible or controversial.
Yeah.
Darwin spent 8 years on barnacles.
Yeah.
Like, I don't need a movie about that. I want to see a movie about Wallace accidentally hanging out with white supremacists.
I mean, we've got house flipping, we've got tropical adventures, we've got disease, we've got ghosts.
There's a whole trilogy here. Sarah, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Once again, This was really good. Listeners, if there is the potential for a tradition here. There are other people we could talk about. I was actually going to ask you, Sarah, so we did Darwin and we did Wallace, and those are kind of the classics. If you were going to suggest a name for future Darwin Day episodes, who would you? I know a couple of names that come to my mind.
So I can think backwards and forwards. Backwards, I think I would think about Humboldt would be fun because he was kind of the first adventurer naturalist. That guy's fascinating and inspired both of them. We could Huxley is fun, right? How he was Darwin's bulldog, and how really he was, the hype man, right? The whole reason like things got out there. And then, you could jump forward, say, to something like what we call now the modern synthesis, when we finally figured out how genetics worked. And so there's a few players in that time that you could kind of pull out. So those are a few that come to my mind.
That's the next 3 years.
There we go.
Done. Got it. Well, and the name that I was going to add to that is Lamarck.
Oh, true. Yeah, absolutely.
Would be a lot of fun to
compare and contrast.
Well, our listeners know what to do.
Make your demands.
If you liked this, if we get requests to do more sort of Darwin Day themed episodes, or more people sort of instrumental in the development of evolutionary theory, or as always, anything you can think of, we'll do it. So we can't. I always hesitate to make long-term promises, but I certainly hope that this isn't the last time we see Sarah on the podcast.
I hope so as well. I love talking with you guys.
No, this has been tons of fun.
Thank you so much for joining us. What are you doing for Darwin Day?
Ooh, man. I don't know. We haven't made plans yet. We haven't planned our events at campus yet, so we got to get on it.
I think that we have exhausted our Wallace stores for this episode, so we'll wrap it up. As always, thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you to the folks who recommended this subject. It turned out to be... We learned a lot. Guest episodes are great because Will and I get to sit here and learn.
It's just getting a private lecture, basically.
Thanks, as always, to our patrons. Find us on the social medias. Check out the blog post that we will write following up this episode. Join us in a fortnight for the next episode of the podcast, which will be an extinction episode, because it is an episode that ends in a 5, so be ready for that. It's going to get depressing.
It's a special episode back to back.
Back to back, and we got things planned. But I think that's it for now. We will sign off with our signature sign-off, which is rambling into the outro music.
Yeah.
So, thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you.
And goodbye for now, everybody.
See you, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.